The young sergeant laughed so hard his coffee nearly came through his nose. "Ma'am, with all due respect," he said, wiping his mouth, "this is a United States Marine Corps sniper training facility. We're not shooting squirrels off a fence post." The old woman standing before him didn't flinch. She just adjusted the worn canvas bag on her shoulder and looked past him toward the distant range where a squad of frustrated Marines had been missing the same target for the past hour. "Son," she said quietly, "you're not reading the wind. That's why every one of those boys is hitting dirt." The sergeant's smile faded. Before he could respond, the crack of another failed shot echoed across the valley. She was right, and she would spend the next 6 hours proving just how wrong he'd been to dismiss her. If this story moves you, type respect in the comments. Because what this grandmother did next left an entire generation of elite marksmen speechless. Eleanor May Dawson arrived at the Hawthorne Ridge training facility on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the aspens had turned gold and the wind came down from the mountains with a bite that reminded her of Korea. She was 78 years old, stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, and wore a faded flannel shirt tucked into work jeans that had seen better decades. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her hands were weathered from a lifetime of work that most people couldn't imagine. She carried no identification that would mean anything to these young men, no medals pinned to her chest, no crisp uniform announcing her credentials. To anyone looking, she was simply an old woman who had wandered too close to a restricted military installation. The MPS who intercepted her near the perimeter fence were polite but firm. This was federal property, authorized personnel only. She would need to turn her vehicle around and head back down the mountain. Eleanor had smiled at them, the kind of patient smile that comes from having explained yourself to skeptical young people more times than you can count, and produced a laminated card from her wallet. The card was old and yellowed, but the seal was unmistakable. The MPs exchanged glances. One of them made a radio call. 10 minutes later, she was being escorted not off the property but deeper into the facility, toward Range 7, where the Marine Scout Sniper Course was conducting long-range qualification exercises. She hadn't asked to go there. She had asked only to visit the memorial stone near the old barracks, the one dedicated to the instructors who had built this program from nothing back when precision shooting was still considered more art than science. But when she mentioned Range 7 by name, when she described the exact location of a drainage culvert that created a thermal pocket at 600 yards, the escorting officer realized this woman knew things about Hawthorne Ridge that weren't in any manual. The scene at Range 7 was exactly what Eleanor had expected, and exactly what she had feared. A squad of 8 Marines lay in prone positions along a firing line, their Barrett M82 rifles pointed toward a series of steel targets arranged at distances ranging from 800 to 2,000 yards. State-of-the-art rangefinders sat beside each shooter. Portable weather stations fed real-time data to tablets mounted on tripods. Ballistic calculators hummed with algorithms designed to account for every variable known to physics. And yet, for the past 45 minutes, not a single round had connected with the farthest target. The 2,000-yard plate, the one that separated the exceptional from the merely excellent. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres stood behind his men, arms crossed, jaw tight with frustration. His team had been handpicked from the best shooters in the battalion, and they were failing. Not because they lacked skill, but because something was wrong with their calculations. The wind data said one thing, the bullets were doing another. Torres had checked and rechecked every piece of equipment. Everything was functioning perfectly, which meant the problem wasn't the gear. Eleanor approached the firing line with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked similar lines 1,000 times before. The escorting officer introduced her only as a visiting consultant, a phrase vague enough to mean anything or nothing. Torres barely glanced at her. He had bigger problems than babysitting some civilian observer, and the brass could explain later why they had authorized a grandma to wander through an active training exercise. "Problem with the 2000?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying just far enough to reach Torres without disturbing the shooters. The sergeant's eye twitched. "Equipment's reading wind at 7 miles per hour from the northwest. We're compensating accordingly. Rounds are still dropping left." Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the distant hillside where the target sat like a tiny grey postage stamp against the brown scrubland. She studied the terrain in silence for nearly a minute. The trees, the rock formations, the way the grass moved in patterns that didn't quite match what the weather station was reporting. Then she pointed toward a shallow ravine roughly 1,200 yards out. invisible to anyone who hadn't spent decades learning to see what the instruments couldn't measure. "Your wind at the muzzle is 7 from the northwest," she said. "But there's a thermal boundary at that ravine. The air temperature drops 8 degrees over about a 40-yard span, creates a crosswind pocket that pushes the round left by about 4 minutes of angle, then a countercurrent at 1600 that partially corrects but introduces a vertical displacement." Torres stared at her. The Marines on the line had stopped firing and were listening now, their expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed amusement. One of them, a lanky corporal named Reeves, actually chuckled. "Ma'am," Torres said slowly, "our atmospheric sensors are reading conditions in real time at multiple points along the trajectory path. They're showing no significant thermal variance." Eleanor smiled again, that same patient smile. "Your sensors are measuring air temperature. They're not measuring air movement caused by differential heating of the ground surface. That ravine is shaded in the morning, but the south-facing slope above it has been baking since dawn. The warm air rises, draws in cooler air from the hollow, creates a rotational current that your instruments are averaging out instead of detecting." She looked at Corporal Reeves, who was still smirking. "How many rounds have you put down range at the 2000? He straightened slightly. 14, ma'am? "And how many hits?" The smirk faded. "None. But the conditions are extremely difficult today." Eleanor nodded. "The conditions are always difficult. That's rather the point." Staff Sergeant Torres had heard enough. Whatever credentials this woman supposedly held, whatever ancient history had earned her a pass onto his range, he wasn't about to let his training exercise turn into a lecture from someone who had probably last fired a weapon during the Johnson administration. He thanked her politely for her observations and suggested that perhaps she would be more comfortable waiting in the observation building while his team completed their qualification attempts. Eleanor didn't argue. She simply asked one question. "May I see your rifle for a moment, Corporal Reeves?" The question hung in the air like the challenge it was. Reeves looked at Torres. Torres looked at the escorting officer. The officer shrugged almost imperceptibly, a gesture that said, "This is above my pay grade, but I'm not going to stop her." Reeves hesitated, then stood and handed over his Barrett with the exaggerated carefulness of someone passing a loaded weapon to a civilian who might not understand which end the bullets came from. Eleanor took the rifle with a familiarity that made Reeves's eyebrows rise. She checked the chamber, noted the round count on the magazine, examined the scope with an appraising eye. Then she lowered herself to the ground with the slow deliberation of aging joints, settled into a prone position that was textbook perfect, and shouldered the weapon as if she had been born holding it. No one spoke. Torres opened his mouth to object, to point out that this was completely unauthorized, that this woman had no business firing a military weapon, that the paperwork alone would be a nightmare. But something in the way she settled behind the rifle stopped him. Her breathing changed. Her body seemed to sink into the earth. Her finger found the trigger guard with the unconscious precision of 10,000 repetitions. She wasn't posing. She was preparing. 2,000 yards, steel plate, third from the left, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Wind 7 at the muzzle, thermal crosswind at 1200, correction factor 4, MOA left, plus 2 MOA elevation through the boundary, countercurrent at 1600, reduces to 1.5 MOA with negative half MOA, vertical terminal wind approximately 9 from the west-northwest due to ridge deflection. She was silent for 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. The Marines watched, some confused, some skeptical, one or two beginning to understand that they were witnessing something outside their experience. Eleanor's finger moved to the trigger. Her breathing stopped, and in the stillness between heartbeats she fired. The report cracked across the valley. Every eye followed the trajectory they couldn't see, waiting for the distant clang of steel or the puff of dirt that would mark another miss. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. Just the echo fading into the mountains. Then, impossibly, beautifully, the clear bright ring of metal on metal rolled back across 2,000 yards of mountain air. A hit. A dead center hit, as they would later confirm through the spotting scope. The plate was still swinging from the impact. No one moved. No one breathed. Corporal Reeves's mouth hung open. Staff Sergeant Torres felt his understanding of the world shift slightly on its axis, making room for something he hadn't believed possible. Eleanor chambered another round without looking at them. "Would you like me to do it again, or shall we discuss thermal wind reading?" Her voice was mild, almost grandmotherly, as if she had just offered to bake cookies rather than shatter everything these elite marksmen thought they knew about their craft. Torres found his voice. "Who are you?" It came out rougher than he intended, almost accusatory, but he had to know. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a fluke shot by some hobbyist who had gotten absurdly fortunate. This was mastery. This was a level of skill he had only heard about in stories, the kind told late at night in sniper school about legends from another era. Eleanor rose from the prone position, slower than she had descended, and handed the rifle back to Reeves. "My name is Eleanor Dawson, but in 1953, when I was 22 years old, and this facility was nothing but a few tents and a lot of ambitious young men who didn't know what they didn't know, they called me Windreader." She paused, watching the recognition dawn on Torres's face. "I was the first woman to qualify as an instructor for the Marine Corps Scout Sniper program. They wouldn't let me wear the uniform officially, of course. Women didn't do such things back then, but they let me teach, because I could see things in the wind that their instruments couldn't measure, and because I could shoot." Torres knew the name. Every sniper who had ever passed through this facility knew the name, though most assumed it belonged to a man or to a myth. Windreader had trained 3 generations of Marine marksmen during the formative years of the program. Windreader had written the manual sections on environmental factors that were still quoted in advanced courses. Windreader had reportedly once made a 2,300-yard shot in Korea to eliminate a Chinese officer who was directing artillery fire on American positions, a shot that was technically impossible according to the ballistics of the era, and yet had saved an estimated 400 lives. The story was taught to every sniper class as an example of what human intuition could achieve beyond the limits of technology. Torres had always assumed it was embellished, a teaching parable rather than history. He looked at Eleanor Dawson, at her weathered hands and silver braid and patient eyes, and realized he was standing before living history, a legend who had been forgotten by a military that had never quite known what to do with her. The rest of that afternoon unfolded like a masterclass in humility. Eleanor didn't lecture, she didn't condescend. She simply walked each of the 8 Marines through what she saw when she looked downrange, what she felt in the way the air moved, what she heard in the subtle variations of wind through different terrain features. She taught them to see the landscape as a living system, not a static obstacle course for their bullets. She showed them how to read the ripple patterns in tall grass, how to watch for the shiver of leaves at specific elevations, how to feel the barometric pressure in their sinuses and factor it into their calculations before any instrument could register the change. "Your technology is magnificent," she told them, standing beside Corporal Reeves as he prepared his 15th attempt at the 2,000-yard target. "But it measures what it can measure. The wind is not a number. The wind is a story. You have to learn to read the story or you will always be one step behind it." Reeves, who had spent $30,000 of military training on state-of-the-art equipment, who had been certain that morning that he understood everything there was to know about long-range shooting, adjusted his scope according to Eleanor's guidance and fired. The plate rang, his first hit of the day. He turned to look at her, and there were tears in his eyes that he would later blame on the dust. By late afternoon, every Marine on that firing line had connected with the 2,000-yard target at least twice. Torres had quietly made a phone call to battalion command, and by the time the sun was touching the western peaks, a convoy of vehicles was making its way up the mountain road. Word had spread with the speed that only military gossip can achieve. The Windreader was alive. The Windreader was at Hawthorne Ridge, and she was teaching again. The commanding officer of the base, Colonel Patricia Hernandez, arrived just as Eleanor was demonstrating the proper way to construct a wind chart, using nothing but observation and memory. Hernandez was 46 years old and had served 3 combat tours. She was also one of the highest-ranking female officers in Marine Corps history, and she had grown up hearing stories about the women who had carved paths before her, the ones who had served without recognition, without medals, without even the dignity of official acknowledgement. She had written her thesis at the Naval War College on unofficial female contributions to military effectiveness in the 20th century. Eleanor Dawson had been Chapter 4. The colonel stopped at the edge of the firing line and simply stood at attention. Torres and his Marines, following her example, did the same. 8 men and 1 woman standing straight and silent before an elderly civilian in a flannel shirt who had never officially worn their uniform, but who had shaped their traditions in ways they were only beginning to understand. Eleanor looked at them for a long moment. Then, slowly, she raised her right hand to her forehead, in a salute that she had never been authorized to give but had earned 1,000 times over. Colonel Hernandez returned it. "Ma'am," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "On behalf of the United States Marine Corps, it is my honor to welcome you home." Eleanor lowered her hand. "I never left, Colonel. I just got older. The mountain stayed the same." She looked back at the distant range, at the target that had humbled 8 elite shooters, until an old woman reminded them what they had forgotten. "Though I will say, your rifles are considerably nicer now. That Barrett is a pleasure to shoot." The Marines laughed, and the tension broke, and what followed was something that none of them had expected when they woke up that morning. Colonel Hernandez had brought with her a small wooden box retrieved from the base archives that contained a set of medals that had been authorized but never presented. 50 years earlier, at the end of the Korean War, a recommendation had been submitted to award Eleanor Dawson the Navy Cross for her actions under fire. The recommendation had been denied on the grounds that a civilian female instructor could not receive combat decorations. The paperwork had been filed away, forgotten by everyone except a few historians who wondered what might have been. But times had changed. Policies had evolved. And Colonel Hernandez, who had spent 3 years navigating military bureaucracy to make this moment possible, had finally received authorization to present the medal that should have been given 6 decades ago. Eleanor accepted it in silence. She held the small bronze cross in her weathered palm and looked at it for a long time, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "I didn't do it for this. I did it because they were my boys and they were dying, and I could see where the enemy was." She closed her fingers around the medal. "But I won't pretend it doesn't matter. It matters. It matters that you saw me. It matters that you remembered. It matters that you're standing here telling me that what I did counted for something, even if the paperwork never said so." She looked at Corporal Reeves, who was still processing everything he had witnessed. "And it matters that you young people understand something. The technology will keep getting better. The instruments will keep getting more precise, but there will always be a moment, in the wind and the chaos and the fear, when you have to trust yourself, when you have to see what the machines can't see. That's not weakness. That's what makes you human, and human beings can do remarkable things if they're willing to learn." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that Eleanor remembered from 1,000 evenings on this same range, she stood with Colonel Hernandez and looked out at the land she'd given her life to defending. The young Marines had returned to their barracks, carrying with them lessons that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. Tomorrow, they would return to their high-tech equipment and their ballistic calculators, but they would return with different eyes. They would look for the story in the wind. They would trust their instincts alongside their instruments. And when the moment came, as it always did, when the technology failed or the calculations fell short, they would remember an old woman with steady hands and patient eyes who had shown them what was possible. Staff Sergeant Torres approached Eleanor as she was preparing to leave. He had been quiet for the past hour, processing not just what he had learned, but what it meant for everything he thought he understood about his profession. "Ma'am," he said, "I owe you an apology. When you arrived this morning, I thought—" He trailed off, embarrassed. Eleanor smiled. "You thought I was a confused old woman who had wandered onto your range. It's all right, Sergeant. I've been underestimated before. It used to bother me. Now I find it rather useful. People tend to show you who they really are when they think you don't matter." She patted his arm. "You showed me something good. You listened. When you realized you were wrong, you didn't dig in your heels and protect your ego. You learned. That's rarer than you might think, and it's the only thing that really matters in the end." Torres walked her to her truck, an ancient Ford that had seen as many decades as its owner. As she climbed into the driver's seat, he asked one more question. "The shot in Korea, the one at 2,300 yards, the one that saved the company, was that real?" Eleanor started the engine. It coughed twice before settling into a steady rumble. "Does it matter? What matters is that those boys made it home. What matters is that when it counted, I did what needed to be done." She looked at him through the open window. "What matters is that tomorrow, if you're ever in a position where you need to make an impossible shot to save lives, you'll know it's possible, because you saw me do it today. Maybe not 2,300, but 2,000 is plenty. 2,000 is enough to believe." She put the truck in gear. "Take care of those young Marines, Sergeant. They're good kids. They just need someone to remind them that experience has value. That old doesn't mean useless. that sometimes the best way forward is to learn from the past. The truck pulled away, kicking up a small cloud of dust that caught the last light of the evening sun and glowed like something holy. Colonel Hernandez watched the taillights disappear down the mountain road, then turned to Torres. "Make sure every instructor on this base hears about what happened today. I want environmental reading drills added to the curriculum. I want the Windreader manual sections taught with context, and I want her invited back as often as she's willing to come." Torres nodded. "Yes, ma'am. What about the 2,000-yard qualification? We still have Marines who haven't passed." The colonel looked at the distant targets, now barely visible in the gathering dusk. "They'll pass, because now they know it can be done. That's half the battle right there. The other half is practice, patience, and humility, which, as of today, they have in abundance." 3 months later, Eleanor Dawson received a letter on official Marine Corps letterhead. The sniper qualification scores at Hawthorne Ridge had improved by 18%. More importantly, the dropout rate for environmental reading coursework had dropped to nearly zero. Marines who had once treated wind estimation as a necessary annoyance were now competing to develop the most accurate observational techniques. The letter was signed by 37 instructors and trainees, each of whom had added a personal note thanking her for reminding them why they did what they did. At the bottom, in a different hand, someone had written, "The wind is a story. We're learning to read it. Thank you for being our teacher." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same drawer where she kept the Navy Cross, alongside a faded photograph of a young woman in civilian clothes standing among a group of Marines in 1953, all of them squinting into a mountain sun that looked exactly like the one that still rose over Hawthorne Ridge every morning. She was 78 years old. She had never worn the uniform. She had never received the official recognition that her male peers took for granted. But she had shaped a tradition. She had saved lives. And on one October afternoon, she had reminded a generation of elite warriors that the most sophisticated weapon in their arsenal was still the human being behind the rifle. Some lessons can only be taught by those who lived them. Some stories can only be told by those who were there, and some shots, the ones that matter most, can only be made by those who learn to trust themselves when every instrument said it was impossible. The wind is still blowing over Hawthorne Ridge, and somewhere in that wind, if you listen carefully, you can hear an old woman's voice, patient and kind, teaching young people how to see what cannot be measured, how to know what cannot be calculated, how to believe what others say is impossible. If this story reminded you that respect has no age limit, that experience is our most valuable teacher, and that the quiet people around us often carry histories we cannot imagine, subscribe to this channel. Because this is what we do here. We find the stories that deserve to be told, we honour the people who deserve to be remembered, and we never ever underestimate the power of someone who has spent a lifetime learning to read the wind.